Thank you for joining the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston for our weekly online ministers forum. I'm the Reverend Dr. Colin, Senior Minister of the congregation. These programs are conversations with community organizers, scholars, religious leaders, artists, and others about how we can collectively address the present crises. Their purpose is to offer members of our community and all who wish to join us online science-based resources and liberation-oriented inspiration to get us through these difficult times. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Sherene Seikaly, co-editor of the Journal of Palestine Studies and an associate professor of history at the University of California, Santa Barbara. We'll be talking about the current situation in Israel-Palestine. Dr. Seikaly's most recent book is Men of Capital, Scarcity and Economy and Mandate Palestine. She's the co-editor of the Journal of Palestinian Studies, the co-founder and co-editor of Jadaliyya, an online e-zine, and a leading expert on the region. Dr. Seikaly, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I thought if we could just maybe start out with kind of like an overview of like what's going on right now from your perspective.
Thank you for having me. The situation as it's unfolding on the ground now is a part of an ongoing struggle between the Zionist movement and the project of having a Jewish homeland in the land of Palestine, and the challenge that movement has faced since its inception, which is how do you shape a Jewish and democratic state when the majority of the people living on that land are not Jewish. This has been Zionism's challenge from its inception, and it continues until today. The thing that is unique about this moment is that the Israeli settler colonial project has set up since 1948 multiple technologies of separating land and people. And through that separation, it has attempted to continue the denial of Palestinian peoplehood. What we have seen in the last 11 days shows us that even in the face of that denial, there is a Palestinian peoplehood that spans across these divides, whether in the Gaza Strip, inside the Green Line among Palestinians in Israel, in the West Bank, or in East Jerusalem.
I think that one of the things that's really difficult sometimes for people to understand who just follow this issue casually and say like the New York Times or CNN or something like that here in the United States is to understand the sort of deep historical context of what's going on. And I know that you've written extensively about that and reflected on that. So could you kind of help us to understand why this conflict is something that is not, doesn't date from 2 weeks ago, doesn't date from 10 years ago, doesn't date from 30 years ago or 40 years ago, but has much deeper roots. Could you sort of offer us some thinking about that?
Thank you so much. So I think one of the things that people should be really clear about is that where we begin this story is actually a political choice. It does not begin, as you suggested, with Sheikh Jarrah and the struggle for people in that East Jerusalem neighborhood to remain on their lands. It doesn't begin then. It doesn't begin in 1993 with the Oslo so-called peace process that essentially expanded Israeli territorial control over the West Bank and that subjected Gaza to basically a condition of quarantine for the last 14 years. It doesn't begin in 1967 when Israel occupied the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem and confined the Palestinians living in those areas to the position of colonized subject, deprived of basic inalienable rights as they remain today. It doesn't even begin in 1948 when 800,000 Palestinians were forced under fire, either were forcibly expelled or fled under fire and became refugees. People need to understand that the birth of the Israeli state came with the birth of the Palestinian refugee condition. And here I will flag what I said earlier about the challenge of what does it mean to establish a Jewish state on a piece of land where the majority of the people were not Jewish. It doesn't, and at that time in 1948, it's important for people to know that Palestinians understand that year as the Nakba, or the catastrophe. That's the year when the majority of Palestinians became either stateless refugees or Palestinians who lived what would be inside what would become the Israeli state. And that's the moment when my parents became refugees, so I'm the child of refugees. And this is important for people to understand that Palestinians call our condition an ongoing Nakba, because the dispossession that happened then continues to happen until today. So it's not a struggle that is over. But I wouldn't even begin this story in 1948. I would actually begin it in 1917 when Arthur Balfour put out something called the Balfour Declaration in November 1917, which committed the British colonial support to Zionism, and defined the Palestinians who lived in Palestine by what they were not. So the memorandum commits to the establishment of a Jewish national home with the qualification that this should not supposedly hurt the civil and religious rights of the non-Jewish population. So here it's really important to look at the ways that the Balfour Declaration establishes Jewish as an ethno-national category in Palestine, against which the majority of the people living there would be defined. And so at this point, 5% of the people living in Palestine are Jewish. These are Palestinian Jews, right? And this is a really important moment to understand the ways in which Palestinians are denied a coherent peoplehood and are denied political rights. Those two patterns are ones that have continued and have been consistent since 1917. To begin the history in 1917 is also to acknowledge the conditions on the ground of settler colonialism. Those are ongoing conditions. I will stop here to say that this is also a very tragic struggle, because the Zionist movement established itself as a response to centuries of Judeophobia in Europe and the late 19th, early 20th century European nation state embrace of racialization and othering in the form of anti-Semitism. And we have to understand anti-Semitism as and the struggle against anti-Semitism as central to all of our battles for liberation, as a key story in what it means to be a modern person, right? And the history of the Holocaust and the Shoah is crucial to that. I want to make 2 points here. First, Zionism, which began to, as an ideology in the late 19th century, Zionism was not the only response to anti-Semitism in Europe. There were multiple other responses that included communism, socialism, immigration, multiple other political and intellectual responses. Second, European Jewish immigration does not begin to escalate in Palestine until 1933 with the rise of Nazi power in Germany. And it's important to note that a lot of Jewish immigrants would come to Palestine at that moment because the doors of the United States and the United Kingdom were closed to those Jewish survivors. Third, what I'd like to say about Zionism in particular is that Zionism ideologues shaped Zionism really as a response to European hierarchies, to European understandings of those who are with history, those who have a history, and those who are people who live outside of a history, those people who are civilized and those people who are backward. The tragedy with Zionism is that it came, people shaped it as a response to this European hierarchy and these kinds of Enlightenment understandings of backwardness and civilization. But then it recreated them in Palestine with the beginning of immigration to Palestine in the late 19th century. So I think it's really, really important to understand those complexities. But I also would urge that the complexities should not obfuscate the ongoing denial of Palestinian basic rights on the land that they have resided on and that their ancestors have resided on for 700 years.
That is, I think, an extraordinarily helpful overview, for what is going on. And the one thing that I might sort of wonder about your reflections on that is sort of within the context of World War I and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire is sort of where the Balfour Declaration emerges, right? And as I understand it, and I don't know whether that's relevant in terms of understanding what how you kind of think of the narrative, but is somebody who has written about that era from sort of the perspective of other national liberation movements at that time. It is, I think, helpful for me, at least, to think about how this relates to sort of, there's an Irish national struggle at the same time. There's Marcus Garvey in the United States is articulating a sort of Pan-African national struggle. And so that there's this sort of larger framework of nationalist ideologies that's kind of emerging at that time, which just to me, flags the ways in which Zionism is perhaps less unique than it might appear to some people. Though, of course, none of those are explicitly religious projects.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it's really important to think about the specificity of Zionism and to put it in conversation with other movements that are taking place. And I think you're absolutely right. World War I is a crucial moment for this. I think it's important to put this into the context of what's happening in the Middle East, the erosion of the Ottoman Empire, as you suggested, which would mean ultimately for Greater Syria, British and French mandatory control. And here I want to talk about the Balfour Declaration in that context. The League of Nations, the precursor to the United Nations, had set up this mandatory rule as a kind of British and French mandatory rule over the former Ottoman provinces of the Arab countries, of the majority Arab countries. And this mandatory rule basically was premised on the idea that the people of what we understand as Greater Syria, so what is now Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, and Israel-Palestine, that these people were not ready to stand up on their own 2 feet. They were not ready for independence. They were semi-civilized, and that they would undergo a period of training in order to rule themselves. In Palestine, however, that equation was troubled by the commitment to the Zionist national project. And so if you were Transjordanian or Lebanese or Iraqi or Syrian, you would ultimately, if only nominally, experience national independence. However, if you were Palestinian, you were basically denied that peoplehood, right? And understood as I mean, the British colonial rule basically took on the Zionist understanding of the people on the land of Palestine, that they were incoherent, that they were a motley crew, that they could be easily displaced, that the elites could be had for a price, and that the rest of the common peasantry and working class would soon forget, right? Their ties to the land. And so I think those distinctions between what's happening in Palestine versus the broader area of Greater Syria is really crucial in terms of national ideologies. And I want to make this point because people often sort of put this forward to further deny Palestinian rights, which is people will often ask me, well, I mean, in 1917, was there a Palestinian nationalism, and was there, you know, a fully formed Palestinian national project? Some people say that there was. I mean, you can read Rashid Khalidi on this. Other people say that there wasn't. I would say that this was still in formation. I would also say that the random and arbitrary lines on a map that colonial and nationalist political kingmakers draw should not determine whether or not people have the right to live on the lands that they resided on for hundreds of years, right? These are people's homes. So I'm really grateful that you bring up this rise of national ideologies as a specific moment in World War I that you know is shaping a different future altogether, right? The three major empires that collapsed after World War I, and now we're facing this entire new kind of you know, territorial nation state order. And I think it's really what Palestinians and the Palestinian struggle has the potential of opening up is, how do we think about peoplehood beyond a nation state framework? Can we imagine a Palestinian liberation that is not tied to the exclusionary nature of territorial nationalism? And this is one of the potentialities of the Palestinian struggle, because in so many ways it is an extension of this 1917 moment of the struggle for the territorial nation state, at the same time that that has become an impossibility on the ground because of Israeli expansionism, because of the ways that the United States in particular, through military aid and through the kind of unequivocal support that the United States has given Israel on the international scale, because of all of these you know, points, that a two-state solution, which was, you know, the foundation of you know, negotiations after 1967, has essentially become impossible on the ground. It has essentially become impossible on the ground because of the settlements, the expansion of settlements that the Oslo process post-1993 enabled. And so now we're in this position. You have these people, and they understand themselves as a united people, and they are making claims to land, to liberty. And how do we deal with this in a way that can offer us something different from what we already know in terms of territorial logics?
Well, I mean, I think that point is just so key, actually, in terms of like the conflicts of the 20th century and into the 21st century, because I mean, World War I really is this moment where nationalisms are being constructed, right? And so it's a moment where like all sorts of peoples across the world are starting to think of themselves as nations. And now in 2021, right, so more than 100 years later, we can see that this sort of functioning of like the people and the nation as a singular entity is not just problematic, but most often leads rise to various forms of what's crudely called right-wing populism. And, and so I think that personally, I mean, I think that one of the intellectual projects that is kind of before those of us who are, you could say, on the left, more committed to human rights, whatever language we want to sort of struggle for, is actually how do we separate nationhood from peopledom in a way that's productive for all peoples. And I think that that's one of the reasons why the Palestinian struggle is so important. And also there are other struggles that one can look at, indigenous struggles, for instance, that I think have a lot to offer us in terms of thinking through how to get beyond the box that people have placed themselves in over the course of the 20th century.
Absolutely. And I would just say that, Indigenous studies scholars, and in my case, my dear friend and comrade, Rana Barakat, who teaches at Birzeit University, has taught me this, that Indigenous studies actually, and Indigenous approaches, invite us to stop asking who owns the land and rather insisting that we belong to the land. Mm-hmm. And I think this shift, what I would invite people to think about in terms of, as you see all of these kind of uprisings and protests and resistance and so on, that all of the people who are doing these protests, all of these Palestinians, they belong to that land, mm-hmm. right? And that is a kind of reframing to think about, not in terms of private property, not in terms of nation states, not in terms of civilized versus backward, or worthiness or unworthiness of self-rule, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, Jared Kushner, basically suggested the Palestinians are not ready to rule themselves. So I think we have to change the terms of the conversation. And I think that at this point, one of the things I really want to name as distinct and important is the way that, the movement for Black Lives, various indigenous struggles from Mauna Kea to Standing Rock, Latinx struggles. There's a moment in which all of these movements are speaking with one another, mm-hmm. overlapping in innovative ways and creating a space for us to shift the terms of the conversation.
So I think that's actually provides a sort of segue for us to think about this question of representation, which I think is so crucial in trying to understand what's going on there. Because you mentioned Jared Kushner and sort of how his very archaic argument that tilts back towards these early 20th century conceptions that are in the Balfour Declaration and elsewhere about how Palestinians aren't capable of self-rule, right? And we see these kinds of representations play out in the media repeatedly in the sort of depictions of the conflict between Israel-Palestine. So I'm wondering if you could kind of expand upon that for us right now.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned at the outset sort of CNN and MSNBC, and I'll just be really honest with you and the audience. I think that for me, I try to avoid those venues when my people are under fire, because there's such a violent erasure of our any basic understanding of Palestinians as people who have rights, right? We are depicted time and time again as irrational, as bloodthirsty, as, if you take a look, there was an internal CNN memorandum that instructed journalists to use the terminology of the Gaza-run Ministry of Health. Right. So that everyone hearing can just think, oh, Hamas run Ministry of Health. Mm-hmm. Oh, Hamas terrorists, we know those irrational, bloodthirsty, so on and so forth. Right. Or they'll say, and they're saying this a lot now, if you're looking at the press, Israel, Hamas battle. This is not an Israel-Hamas battle. This is an Israeli-Palestinian struggle. Okay. And when CNN and the MSNBC uses the language, for example, they're always talking about Hamas targets when they're talking about Gaza. If you read the Arabic press or you read some of the European press, you learn what are those Hamas targets. Well, one of the Hamas targets, for example, quote unquote Hamas targets, was the only COVID testing laboratory in the Gaza Strip that Israel's precision rockets destroyed. A sponge factory, an ice cream factory, homes, 50 schools. These are all made illegible under the label of Hamas targets. So the kinds of violent racializations and erasures of Palestinians in the US media is one of the most sort of consistent denials of Palestinian peoplehood. And this is what gets me so upset when US citizens and people in the United States, when these kinds of spectacular moments of violence break out and everyone starts talking about, oh, I'm so confused. Oh, I'm so confused. Oh, I don't know how to follow it. Oh, we are not innocent bystanders in the United States. Every single person in the United States who is a US taxpayer is complicit in the kind of diplomatic umbrella that the United States has afforded the state of Israel in the $3.8 billion that it provides in military aid every year. We are not innocent bystanders in this struggle. And I think it's really important that people educate themselves. And now, there are in the digital age with all of its surveillance, we don't need to celebrate it because it has a lot of potential, real existing dangers. There are multiple voices to listen to. And I think one of the things that has happened in this latest outbreak is that there you see many more Palestinian voices on these mainstream venues. You also see a kind of shift in what is possible to say. So I think it was Ali Vash on MSNBC who used the language of apartheid. This is the language that Palestinian activists have been putting forth for 20 years. They have been saying, this is apartheid. How do we define apartheid? Apartheid is when your access to rights is contingent on how the state defines you. And there are different access to rights in what is Israel-Palestine today based on how the state defines you. So there, you do see a shift, right? People in the mainstream, John Oliver did this too, right? You see Rashida Tlaib and the Squad and Ilhan Omar and, AOC and so on and so forth. I think for me, as somebody that's been involved in this struggle for as long as I have, it's really important for people to recognize that this kind of discursive shift, this kind of shift in language, is a culmination of decades of Palestinians calling this out as apartheid, of Palestinians calling for boycott, divestment, sanctions, of all of this labor that has opened up the possibility for people to shift their terms. I get really tired of, I was just on in a conversation where that kind of, the importance of popular movements, the importance of unseen activists, the importance of all that labor that is grinding and slow, what Gramsci would have called a war of maneuver, right? That requires kind of holding on for long periods of time. And it's really important to recognize that, right? That these shifts did not happen out of a vacuum and one day, John Oliver woke up and said, oh, it's apartheid. No, we have been laying the ground for this, and I think it's really important for everybody watching, and thank you for watching if you are, to really try and uplift and center Palestinian voices, to listen to Palestinian voices, to read Palestinian scholarship, right? And to engage that knowledge production.
I think that there's a couple of things there that you said that are, I think, super important for, I guess, our viewers, people who are watching to think about. And really is this sort of the slow war of maneuver, to talk about it in Gramscian terms, but the importance of popular movements in really shifting consciousness, right? And that what we have repeatedly seen in the last 5 years, if even that, has been sort of the way in which decades of work on the part of popular movements can start to shift at least the conversation that's happening amongst kind of people like John Oliver, right? Whether this ends up translating into policy is a question, that I think is actually a question that we're still wrestling with right now in terms of what happens. But it definitely changes the kinds of namings that can happen in the sort of public sphere right now. And I think that that's really important to recognize and to kind of understand, like, how, if we're committed to, within the Unitarian Universalist tradition, the idea that all people have inherent worth and dignity, like, it really is about this sort of slow work of movement building that is going to carry us forward collectively as a human community, rather than perhaps anything else.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, I really want to again kind of emphasize the interesting moment we are in right now. So we're just coming out in the United States. We are just coming out of this, Trump nightmare, and I think in the wake of that Trump nightmare, both the Republican Party and, to a much lesser extent, the Democratic Party are facing a moment of existential definition.
Mm-hmm.
Who are we, and what do we stand for? And I think within, the unequivocal support for Israel has been a bipartisan commitment since
Mm-hmm.
1948. And I think that, we've spent a lot of time again in the US media focusing on the internecine struggle with the Republican Party. I think we should also be thinking about how the Democratic Party is changing. And one of the ways that the Democratic Party is changing is to begin to listening to Palestinian voices pushing back against this kind of unequivocal support for Israel, but not just Palestinian voices. And here I really want to acknowledge and recognize the also decades-long work of Jewish Americans who are saying time and time again, not in our name. This is not in our name. And I think that there are multiple kind of, when I was in New York as a graduate student in the first decade of the 21st century. It's funny to do it in those terms. At that time, a group that I was very close to was a group called Jews Against the Occupation, which had actually started as Queer Jews Against the Occupation, which I think the link between queer organizing and Jewish American anti-Zionism is a really interesting one. But I also think that, what I'm trying to highlight is that it is very important to understand that Jewish Americans, and particularly new generations of Jewish Americans, the younger generations, are not accepting wholesale that Israel represents them and their interests. And I cannot emphasize enough how important this is, because I actually think, and if we look to the Jewish tradition itself, it's that tradition and that history that explains to us that if there are some people who aren't free, none of us can be free, right? And that this ongoing denial of basic Palestinian rights in their lands is ultimately also not good for Jewish people, and I think there is a big movement now that has continued this labor, this decades-long labor, and I think we really need to pay attention to it, and also to support people, because just like Palestinians speaking out, these people have sustained a lot of frontal attack.
I mean, there's a lot of things I could say in response to that very provocative and I think thoughtful statement or series of statements. I think one thing that I feel like I kind of want to maybe just offer up from some work that I've been doing on populism would be that I think that one of the key questions of sort of, I would say, the sort of radical democratic theorist minority of folks who study populism, people like myself or Laura Groton, is that populism is not about the elites versus the non-elites, but about the question of who is the people. And that one of the things that I think we're seeing right now with the Democratic Party is a redefinition of who the people is into a sort of pluralistic definition of peoplehood, right? And so that you see, and that this is the tension point in the Democratic Party, and that this is actually the existential moment we're sort of in with both the political parties in the United States. The Republican Party is making a very clear choice that the people is a white supremacist people, and that's just, it's very clear. We can look at their rhetoric, we can look at their propaganda, and just, who is present in January 6th and what are they saying in the Capitol Rotunda, right? And within the Democratic Party, I think one of the reasons why there's tensions there is because there is this sort of question over things like, should the Palestinians be included in some sort of pluralistic definition of the people? Or is the people that the Democratic Party would seek to represent exclusive of that? And I don't know, just like something that I've been working on and that your comments really brought up for me.
I just also would say that this question of who are the people is one that really occupied me in my experience of, so I lived in Cairo for 5 years from 2009 to 2014. I taught at the American University in Cairo, and I experienced the revolution there. And one of the questions that continues to occupy me is, who are the people? Who is this collective noun? How does it shift? And so that's a really powerful question. And I agree with you. I think that the existential crisis is, what is America? What is America? What is the future of America? And all of these efforts to, to contain electoral participation that we're seeing across the country is a direct reaction to the fact that it was people of color, and particularly Black Americans, who delivered us from Trump, right? And I think that this is not a question that the Democratic Party and the Democratic Party establishment is yet comfortable with. I think they're going to have to make a choice. Do they want to continue their intimate complicity in how the United States has functioned, itself a settler colony, itself the home of empire? Is it going to continue towing the line at every turn of that establishment politics? Or is it going to be a place where people of color, working class people, can actually push for change and can actually shape a political leadership that looks much more like what America actually looks like?
I think that this is probably the key political question in the United States and perhaps the world over the next few decades. I mean, like maybe climate. Well, I don't think you actually get to resolving the climate crisis if you can't. These questions, I think, are deeply intertwined in terms of how we might approach the climate crisis and the question of who are the people. So I know we're sort of starting to run close on time, and one of the comments things that is related to this that we sort of wanted to talk about, I know, was sort of the question of liberal imperialism and how that relates to the struggle in Israel-Palestine. And I actually think it's intimately related to kind of some of the issues we were just talking about, because liberal states organize rights around citizenship. And there is a very long history of linkage, to put it, I guess, perhaps most mildly, between liberalism and imperialism. But I know you have some interesting reflections on that, and I'd like to offer you a chance to sort of share with us around that.
Thank you. Well, I mean, I think I'll answer this question in two ways. One is the problem with liberalism. And then the second is, what do people on the left, like us, or however we want to define ourselves, right, what do we do with the potential death of liberalism? Mm-hmm. So on the first point, I think, and I always say this to students when we're talking about the Enlightenment and its relationship to anti-Semitism. Because as we've learned from that history, basically the Enlightenment movement said to Jewish people, you can join us, mm-hmm, and come out of your segregated enclosures, but only if you keep who you are at home, right? Mm-hmm. So Judah Leib Gordon was, one of his famous sort of injunctions is to say, be a Jew at home and a man on the street. Mm. And I think, the way I always teach this is, any movement that tells you can belong as long as you look more like me, mm-hmm, is not one that you want to be part of. Mm-hmm. And that kind of deep contradiction within Enlightenment thought that maintained European supremacy, that maintained a racialized order, is incredibly instructive, and then gets within the Zionist movement reconstituted, right? Mm-hmm. And here I want to also flag that reconstitution within Zionism didn't just and continue to harm and damage and deny Palestinian rights, but also create hierarchies within Jewish Israeli social formations that placed Ashkenazim at the very, European Jewish people at the very top of the hierarchy, and then kind of differentiated between Mizrahim, or Arab Jews, Eastern Jews, African Jews. So I think that we have to understand how these kinds of liberal logics, mm-hmm, work to shape and reshape hierarchy and racialization and the exclusion of people from the category of the civilized, and even from the category of the human, And I think here we can just flag for another conversation how this also works to deem certain people killable, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I feel like I've spent most of my life critiquing liberalism, mm-hmm, and shredding it to bits. And in a way, my book is kind of a critique of Arab liberalism. Mm-hmm. But I'll be super honest and say that, at different moments in my life, one of them was the moment of the Egyptian Revolution, when it was basically the demands on the streets were more or less requests for liberal reform. Mm-hmm. And then again, during the Trump era, mm-hmm, where, again, in the Palestinian struggle, for example, the United Nations has been the United Nations and international law more generally, mm-hmm, has been a structure of denial of basic Palestinian rights. And, mm-hmm, the best person on this is Noura Erakat, who's written a book called Justice for Some. So we know that. But then in the face of not having the United Nations and not having a post-World War I order, we have the basic kind of outlines of international law, is also terrifying. So yes, we are forced to use the language and the tools of the very structures that have denied us and erased us and continue to do that. But do we not want to have those tools?
Right.
So I think this is something that we have to continue thinking through.
Well, I mean, I think it's really one of the things that, I mean, I think I'm very much like you in this, right? In that one of the things that the recent experience with Trump made me really clearly understand is that liberalism, for all of its horrors, I mean, I don't really know, like, it's not really flaws, right? But
right, no, that's fair.
Is preferable to totalitarianism, right? And that if like the choice is liberalism or totalitarianism, then it's pretty clear that whatever like my personal political positionality is towards liberalism, I'm much more opposed to totalitarianism than I am liberalism, and that there are, alliances that can be made and should be made to sort of struggle against totalitarian regimes, no matter what. I mean, Chomsky has this wonderful interview that's like, I don't know, 15 years ago, that he talks about expanding the floor of the cage. And he sort of talks about how within, a liberal regime, we're sort of bound within certain circumstances, but within that context, we can struggle to expand kind of what the boundaries we're stuck in, with the idea that eventually maybe that will make us strong enough to break free from the cage. But with the totalitarian regime, the cage gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until life within it is simply impossible. And so, I think that that's kind of one of the lessons of the last 4 years for me personally, is that, we have to struggle against both of these things at the same time, recognizing that we're going to have to make some kind of alliances, and that we're going to end up having to make alliances with the liberal state until such time, perhaps, as popular movements are strong enough to posit alternatives, which happens, right? I mean, like, we know, listeners here will know that we've done shows on Rojava and the Kurdish revolution, or will know that I've done a great deal of work over the years with Zapatistas, right, which are like ways in which, people are thinking outside of or organizing outside of kind of the cage of liberalism.
Right. So. No, I take your point completely, and I retract if I said flaws. I do think that liberalism is, constitutively premised on European supremacy, definitely. Born of it and, committed to it. And I also think I just want to say something about the Trump era, which was, the Trump era plus the COVID crisis together did something for people who are, let's say, more privileged in the United States. I'm not talking about people of color. I'm not talking about working class people. Not to say that there aren't privileged people of color. But I think one of the things that the Trump era did was finally put a needle in the balloon of American exceptionalism, where people have, myself included, I never thought Trump was going to win that election. No, never in America. Come on, they're too liberal for that, right? And I think there is a kind of potential in this moment where catastrophe has been generalized, where precarity has been generalized, where people have been able to really comprehend that maybe we're not so exceptional. That is, there's a lot of potential there for new ideas and new alliances and new movements.
Well, and I think actually, in some ways, if we reflect on the 2020 presidential campaign, there's some sort of moments in that are kind of interesting to that point, where it really becomes about Biden not running away from liberalism, because he certainly doesn't do that, but he does not frame much of the 2020 presidential campaign within the context liberalism. He really frames it within the question of like, who is the people or peoplehood, right? So if we go and look at his rhetoric fairly carefully, there's, it's the battle for the soul of the nation.
Right.
There's, he has all of these phrases where he talks about Black people and brown people and queer people and transgender people and indigenous people, like doing X, Y, and Z, right? And it's very different than the sort of vision put forward about peoplehood that's offered by the Trump in that moment.
And honestly, by Obama. I mean,
right.
Who would think that it would be Joe Biden who would be putting forward a new language? And I think it's because of the people that elected him into power and the people who made the movement possible. We have to somehow also hold space for the fact that this kind of discursive shift is really not just possible, but something that we can affect. And I would add to that I think U.S. empire is in crisis.
Sure.
It's been in crisis since September 11. And I think that the election of Trump was also linked to the attenuation and crisis of U.S. empire. And I think we have to do some really serious things. Sometimes I feel like when I'm in conversations, it's the fact that this is an imperial country, that we are citizens of empire, somehow falls out of the consciousness of our conversations. It somehow gets to the side. And it's like, this is the moment where we can actually begin to connect the dispossession that we see within the United States to the dispossession that U.S. empire has created globally.
Right. And that's why the legacy of something like the Black Panther Party is so extraordinary, right? I mean, they are organized along that point. And I mean, I was just walking through the Third Ward here in Houston with a friend of mine yesterday, yes. And one of the things that we were talking about was the fact that much of the Third Ward is now called Midtown, right? Which is like, this term that developers have come up with to essentially dispossess the historic Third Ward community, which is actually the sort of heart of the affluent African-American community in Houston from this area that they've occupied, because it's like, well, it's not Third Ward, it's Midtown, which is somehow this other thing that has like taken part of these communities and turned it into something else.
Well, I mean, if I know we're running out of time, sure, you have to go and I have to go too, but I want to just say, apropos Houston. So as you said, I'm, a co-editor along with Rashid Khalidi of the Journal of Palestine Studies. And when we were working on our sort of from the editors for the last issue, not this one, I was really occupied by the power outage in Texas. And I was really occupied by it because I was so fascinated with how people were talking about it in Palestine, in India, in Lebanon, Syria, and Egypt, where, there was a tinge of Schadenfreude, but there was also a kind of, oh, well, we would expect this to happen in Gaza or in Kolkata, but not in Texas. And it just really troubled me, because I think we have that work to do in Palestine too, which is to say, no, actually, it's not surprising.
Right.
Because these conditions actually reproduce, because this actually, the dispossession in the United States is inextricable from these broader imperial dispossessions. And so I started thinking, okay, how do I think about Palestine and Texas together? And, I consulted with scholars and friends who gave me reading lists. And, I started at Wikipedia, which we all start with. And I have to tell you, I started reading and I thought, oh my God, if I thought Israel-Palestine was complicated, this is a whole other level of 500 years of multiple different kinds of settlement and dispossession
Sure.
and battles and, waves of dispossession of all of the native peoples, and native peoples holding ground for long periods of time in Texas, and the struggle of enslaved people, and then the struggle, and I just think that now is the time to think about these histories together, and to understand what the commonalities are, what the differences are, because I think that's the way that we try to envision a different order in the future.
Well, we could go on for quite a bit because I think that that's actually an incredibly interesting point, but I know that I need to draw this to a close. So I would just like to thank you for being with us and say that this was a very excellent conversation, and I certainly learned a lot and really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be in conversation with you, and I've learned so much from this conversation and our past conversation, and thank you to everyone who's listening.
Well, and for those of you who are with us for the first time, let me say a few words about Unitarian Universalism. We're a religious tradition that celebrates the possibility of goodness within each human heart, the transformative power of love, and the clarifying force of reason. We believe we need not think alike to love alike. If you found this video to be helpful, please consider joining us for our weekly worship service. It's posted online each Sunday at 10:30 a.m. Central and features music and prayers in addition to a sermon. This week, I'll be preaching on humanism and a just world. Thank you to our staff for making this video possible. It was produced by Christian Holmes. Alma Viscara assisted with the editing. We'll see you all online soon and in person, hopefully on July 11th, when we'll be reopening our campus for in-person services. Please remember that no matter how isolated you feel, we're all in this together.